In the Wolf Kingdom, the name Aria was known in a way that was far from glorious. She was no warrior, no powerful Luna, and certainly not an Omega sought after by Alphas. Aria was famous for one reason only. She was considered the weakest Omega to ever exist. No one had ever sensed her pheromones. No one had ever seen her wolf. And in a world where strength dictated everything, that made her an existence that was almost meaningless. For the past 3 years, Aria had lived in the Alpha King's palace like a silent shadow. She scrubbed the cold stone floors of the Great Hall, served wine at the banquets of powerful Alphas, and always bowed her head as they passed by. Young Alphas often mocked her, calling her a useless Omega. Other Omegas avoided her as if her weakness were a shameful, contagious thing. Even the Pax Luna had once said before everyone that Aria did not even deserve to be called an Omega. Aria was used to it. She was used to remaining silent when ridiculed, used to bowing her head when others barked orders, used to existing in the shadows of the vast palace where no one truly saw her. But no one in the kingdom knew that Aria's life was about to change on a single night, the night of the Blood Moon ceremony. It was the night when the strongest Alphas of every pack gathered in the royal hall to witness an ancient ritual, one believed to prove their strength before the entire wolf world. And on that very night, something unprecedented in history occurred. Just as the red moon reached the zenith of the sky, every single Alpha in the hall suddenly dropped to their knees as if forced by an invisible power. Confusion spread through the room as the kingdom's strongest warriors could not stand on their own 2 feet. Then, all eyes turned toward a single person, Aria, the weakest Omega in the kingdom. And when the Alpha King stepped before her, the entire hall held its breath. The man who had never bowed to anyone slowly dropped to one knee before Aria, then spoke in a deep voice that echoed throughout the room. "Bow before your queen." That moment changed Aria's entire world. Within a few heartbeats, the girl once regarded as the most useless Omega in the kingdom had become the center of an ancient secret that the wolf world had forgotten for centuries. But to understand why the Alpha King knelt before her in the royal hall, why the strongest Alphas of the packs could not stand on their feet, we must turn back time to the moment before it all happened. It all began that morning, before the moon turned red, before the packs gathered in the palace for the Blood Moon ceremony, and before Aria discovered that her true identity was nothing like what the entire kingdom believed. That morning, while the powerful Alphas prepared for the biggest ritual of the year, Aria was still just an invisible Omega servant in the palace. No one saw her, no one cared about her, and no one in the palace knew that in just a few hours, the very girl most looked down upon in this place would make the entire wolf world kneel before her. That is precisely where the story truly begins. Part 1. The Weak Omega. Chapter 1. The Omega Servant. Mornings in the royal palace always began before the sun truly rose. As the first light of dawn touched the towering stone walls of the fortress, the servants were already forced to wake and prepare for a new day. Within the long, cold stone corridors, the sound of their hurried footsteps echoed steadily, mingling with the scent of wood smoke from hearths just reignited to drive away the early chill. Aria had long been accustomed to that rhythm. She woke before the light flooded the high windows of the palace, donned her simple servant's dress, and began her familiar chores. No one assigned her any important tasks. Most of the time, Aria only handled the trivial errands that no one else wanted, such as scrubbing the stone floors of the Great Hall, clearing tables after the Alpha's late-night banquets, or carrying wine trays along the palace's vast hallways. To most who lived here, Aria was nearly invisible. It was not that they did not see her, but rather that they did not find her worthy of notice. In the world of wolves, everything revolved around strength. Alphas were born to lead, betas to serve and protect, and Omegas usually brought balance to the pack. But Aria was unlike any other Omega. She had no pheromones. At least, that was what everyone believed. No Alpha had ever sensed her scent. No Alpha reacted when standing near her. And that made Aria an anomaly in the eyes of everyone in the palace. An Omega with no scent. An Omega that no Alpha wanted. The palace where Aria lived was not only the residence of the royal pack, but also the center of power for the entire Wolf Kingdom. The ancient stone walls were carved deep with old runes, and at the far end of the vast hall sat the black stone throne, where Alpha King Adrian Voss usually presided when summoning pack leaders. The name Adrian Voss was spoken throughout the kingdom with near absolute awe. He was the youngest Alpha King to ever unite the packs after the Great War several years ago, and he was also the man whom no Alpha dared to openly challenge. In the palace, merely hearing his name was enough to make servants like Aria bow their heads even lower. But to Aria, the Alpha King remained a distant figure, because in her 3 years of living at the palace, She had rarely seen him at close range. When Adrian Voss appeared in the great hall, servants like her had to stand against the walls, bow their heads, and avoid his gaze. Thus, in Aria's mind, the Alpha King was like a storm in the sky, powerful, dangerous, and belonging to a world entirely different from her own. That morning, Aria walked through the great hall with a silver tray in her hand. The early sunlight streamed through the high windows, creating long streaks of light on the marble floor. At the end of the room, a group of young alphas sat around a large wooden table. Before them, the wine bottles left over from the night before. One of them spotted Aria first. He frowned, then let out a laugh. "Look who it is," he said with a mocking tone. "The scentless Omega." The other alphas turned their heads. One leaned forward, taking a deep breath as if trying to catch a scent in the air. "Still nothing," he sneered. "I swear this girl isn't even a real Omega." Laughter erupted across the table. Aria continued walking, keeping her gaze fixed on the floor as she had done for the past 3 years. Silence was always the easiest way to make things end faster. But that morning, an alpha stood up from the table. "Wait." His voice rang out from behind, forcing Aria to stop. She turned and bowed slightly according to a servant's protocol. "Do you lords require more wine?" That alpha stepped closer. When he stopped in front of Aria, the powerful pheromones of an alpha spread around like a heat wave. "I'm just curious," he said. "If you are truly an Omega, then where are your pheromones?" Another alpha laughed from the table. "Maybe she's defective. Or maybe she doesn't even have a wolf," another added. Laughter rang out again. Aria did not answer. She had heard those words too many times already. In truth, Aria herself did not know the answer. 3 years ago, she had been brought to the palace by an old man who told her this place would protect her. Then he vanished, and Aria began a servant's life that no one truly cared about. But as Aria turned to leave the hall that morning, a strange sensation suddenly appeared in her chest, a light throb, very faint but clear, as if something were waking up deep inside her body. Aria paused in the hallway, her hand unconsciously placing itself over her heart. In the distance, the morning sky began to turn a pale red. Another servant ran past her and said hurriedly, "Hurry, the packs have begun to arrive. Today is the day of the blood moon ceremony." Aria stepped to the large window in the hallway and looked out at the sky. High above, the moon still hung faintly on the horizon, but its color seemed deeper than usual. She did not know why, but in that moment, a strange sense of unease spread through her body, as if the whole world were waiting for something to happen. And Aria had no idea that in just a few hours, she would become the center of an event that would make the entire wolf kingdom tremble. Chapter 2. The Scentless Omega. The royal hall grew more crowded by the hour as the day of the blood moon ceremony approached. Pack leaders from across the kingdom passed through the palace's great gates one after another, bringing their entourages and most formidable warriors. The thud of leather boots on stone floors, the clashing of metal armor, and the thick scent of alpha pheromones mingling in the air made the entire hall vibrate with power. For servants like Aria, days like these were always the most difficult, for the more alphas appeared, the greater the chance she would become a laughingstock before the crowd. Aria stood near the long table in the center of the hall, carefully arranging crystal glasses onto a silver tray. She kept her gaze fixed on the stone floor as always, trying to finish her work as quickly as possible to leave the room before anyone noticed her existence. But luck was rarely on Aria's side. "Stop!" The Luna's cold voice rang out from the stone steps near the throne, causing a portion of the hall to suddenly fall silent. The alphas chatting nearby turned their heads immediately. Aria knew that voice. She halted and turned, bowing reflexively as the Luna of the royal pack descended from the high steps. The Luna's gaze halted on Aria as if she had just seen something distasteful. She observed her for a few seconds, before sneering, speaking loud enough for the surrounding alphas to hear that she had always wondered why the palace kept such a useless Omega in this place. Within seconds, the attention of the entire hall shifted toward Aria. The young alphas standing nearby began to laugh. One of them remarked that he had never understood why the palace allowed an Omega with no pheromones to serve in the royal hall. Another alpha leaned forward, taking a deep breath in the air as if searching for something, then shook his head with amusement. "Still nothing," he said. "I swear this girl isn't even a real Omega." Laughter erupted across the room. The Luna looked at Aria with contempt, stating that if she were truly an Omega, she would certainly have pheromones. A young alpha stepped out from the crowd, smiling with a malicious curiosity. He approached Aria and intentionally released his pheromones. The powerful scent of an alpha surged into the air like a heat wave. a pressure intense enough to make many Omegas lose control. But Aria simply stood still, showing no reaction, no sign that her pheromones were being stimulated. A few seconds of silence passed before laughter rang out through the hall. The Alpha turned back to the Luna with a look of victory, saying it was clear this girl wasn't even a real Omega. Other Alphas began to laugh louder, and Aria felt those gazes like needles piercing her. The Luna stared at her for a long moment, then suddenly raised her hand. The sound of the slap rang out sharply in the middle of the hall. Aria's head tilted to the side, her cheek burning. She bowed her head, trying to keep her face devoid of any emotion, but her hands clenched so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "Never forget your place," the Luna said in a frigid voice. "You are just a defective Omega." Laughter rang out again. But while most people in the hall were mocking Aria, there was one person who did not laugh. Across the room, near the large stone pillars of the hall, a young Alpha stood quietly observing. He was taller than most around him, dark hair falling lightly over his forehead, and his sharp, cold gaze followed Aria thoughtfully. Unlike the other Alphas, he did not join in the mocking laughter spreading through the room. His gaze lingered on Aria a bit longer, as if trying to understand something. His name was Lysander Vale, a young Alpha famous among the palace's warrior ranks. And in that moment, when the other Alpha's pheromones failed to trigger any reaction from Aria, Lysander frowned slightly. He had once read something in the ancient books of the royal library. An Omega with no pheromone scent is sometimes not because she is weak or defective, but because her pheromones are being sealed. The thought flashed through Lysander's mind so quickly that he himself wasn't sure if he believed it. But his gaze still halted on Aria for a few more seconds before she turned to leave the hall. Aria walked quickly out of the room, trying to ignore the laughter still echoing behind her. As she entered the quieter corridors of the palace, a familiar sensation appeared in her chest once more. A light throb, very faint but clear. Aria paused for a moment and looked out the large corridor window. The sky outside had begun to turn a pale red as the moon gradually appeared on the horizon. Another servant ran past her in a hurry, saying the major packs had almost all arrived. In just a few hours, the greatest ritual of the year would begin. Aria looked up at the sky, where the moon was slowly shifting into a crimson hue. Today was the day of the blood moon ceremony, and she had no idea that in just a few hours, that very ritual would change her entire destiny. Chapter 3. The Blood Moon Ceremony. As the sun gradually sank behind the distant mountain ranges of the kingdom, the royal palace began to transform. Great torches were lit along the ancient stone walls, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows upon the wolf symbols carved throughout the hall. The air grew heavier and more solemn than usual, as if the palace itself understood that tonight was a night unlike any other. The blood moon ceremony occurred only once a year. It was an ancient ritual of the wolf kind, where the strongest alphas gathered to witness vows of power and reaffirm the order among the packs. For many warriors, it was an opportunity to display their strength. For pack leaders, it was where new alliances were forged. But for servants like Aria, it was simply a night longer than most. The royal hall was now nearly packed to capacity. Alphas from across the kingdom stood in small groups, conversing in low, deep voices. Their cloaks bore the sigils of their respective packs, and the powerful scent of their pheromones mingled in the air like an invisible storm. Aria stood near the back wall of the hall, her hands gripping the silver tray tightly as if it were the only thing keeping her steady amidst a room full of powerful alphas. She tried to keep herself as far from the center as possible, hoping no one would notice her tonight. But no matter how hard she tried, Aria could not stop the strange sensation rising within her body. Ever since the moon began to turn red, that familiar throb in her chest had reappeared. This time it was stronger, no longer just a vague feeling. It was like a wave of energy gradually spreading through her entire being. Aria tightened her grip on the silver tray. She did not understand what was happening to her, but she felt clearly that something was shifting. Across the hall, Lysander Vale still stood among the palace warriors. His gaze swept over the crowded room calmly, but when he saw Aria standing near the back wall, his eyes paused briefly. In that moment, Lysander sensed something he had never felt before. A very light ripple, fleeting as a breeze, but it was enough to make him frown. He turned his head toward the other alphas in the hall. No one seemed to notice a thing. Only he could feel it. Lysander's gaze returned to Aria. This time he was certain of what he had just felt. An Omega with no pheromones could not produce that kind of energy, unless the thought had just surfaced in his mind when the great doors of the hall suddenly burst open. The sound of metal rang out as the heavy doors parted to either side. A guard stepped in first, his voice booming across the room. Alpha King Adrian Voss has arrived. The entire hall fell silent instantly, the alphas turning in unison toward the entrance. And at the far end of the room, Aria felt the throb in her chest suddenly double in intensity, as if her body had just recognized the arrival of something that she herself did not yet understand. Chapter 4. The ritual begins. The entire royal hall plunged into silence the moment the guard announced the Alpha King's arrival. Low conversations ceased instantly, and dozens of eyes turned in unison toward the great doors that had just swung open. In the pale red light of the blood moon rising in the sky outside, a man stepped into the hall with steady, deliberate strides. Adrian Voss, the Alpha King of the Wolf Kingdom. His mere presence was enough to shift the atmosphere of the room. The alphas standing near the aisle bowed their heads slightly according to protocol, not because they were forced to, but because instinct compelled them to acknowledge the power of the man walking past them. Adrian Voss did not wear battle armor, yet the long black cloak draped over his shoulders still carried the aura of a warrior accustomed to the battlefield. His gaze was cold and calm as it swept across the crowded hall, as if everything in the room were under his control. At the back of the hall, Aria stood near the stone wall like a shadow amidst the crowd. She did not look directly at the Alpha King, but the moment he entered the hall, a strange sensation immediately spread throughout her body. The familiar throb in her chest suddenly grew stronger. It was no longer just a slight vibration. It felt like an awakening current of energy, spreading from her chest to every part of her being. Aria tightened her grip on the silver tray, struggling to stay upright. She did not understand what was happening to her, but the feeling became clearer as the Alpha King advanced deeper into the hall. Across the room, Lysander Vale was also observing. His sharp gaze scanned the alphas gathered around the hall before halting on Aria. Since the ritual began, he had sensed something very strange in the air. It wasn't alpha pheromones, nor was it like any energy he had ever felt before. But as he looked toward Aria, the sensation became undeniable, as if its source originated from her. In the center of the hall, an elderly man stepped forward toward the black stone throne. He wore the long robes of the Royal Council of Scholars, his silver hair tied neatly behind his back. This was High Elder Cassian, the one responsible for leading the ancient blood moon ceremony. He raised his hand, signaling the entire hall to be silent. Tonight, his voice rang out deep and clear. We gather under the light of the blood moon to reaffirm the order of the packs and the strength of the alphas who lead them. The alphas standing around the hall listened in silence. High Elder Cassian continued to recite the ancient verses of the ritual, words that had been passed down through centuries. The torches along the walls flickered slightly as the night wind drifted in from the palace's high windows. Ancient legend says, he continued, that under the blood moon, the ancient bloodline of the Luna will be recognized if it still exists in this world. A few alphas chuckled softly upon hearing that part. The tale of the Luna dynasty had long been regarded as mere myth, a lineage that had vanished from the wolf world hundreds of years ago. But as High Elder Cassian read the next lines of the ritual, Aria felt her body heat up. The throb in her chest became violent, as if something were fighting to wake up from deep within her. Aria unconsciously placed her hand over her heart. She did not realize that across the hall, Lysander Vale had seen everything. His eyes narrowed as he noticed Aria's breathing change. Impossible, he whispered to himself. In the center of the hall, High Elder Cassian raised the ceremonial staff high and recited the final line of the ancient verse. If the last Luna still exists. Right then, something strange happened. An alpha standing near the center of the hall suddenly buckled. The sound of knees hitting the stone floor rang out clearly in the silence. The entire hall turned to look. That alpha immediately tried to stand, his face clouded with confusion, as if he himself did not understand what had just happened. A few people laughed, thinking he had simply lost his balance. But Lysander did not laugh. He stared at the alpha, struggling to rise. Then, his gaze slowly shifted back to Aria, because in that moment, he had just realized something terrifying. That alpha hadn't lost his balance, he was unable to stand. And while the rest of the hall still did not understand what was occurring, Lysander Vale began to believe that the ancient legend everyone mocked might be true. In just a few seconds, the entire hall would understand it as well. Chapter 5. When the king knelt. For a few seconds after the first alpha buckled to the stone floor, the entire hall still failed to grasp what had just happened. Some thought he had simply lost his balance, perhaps from the exhaustion of the long journey to the palace. A few other alphas even chuckled, dismissing it as merely a moment of embarrassing clumsiness. But as the man struggled to rise and found himself unable to lift his knees from the cold stone, the laughter began to die away. He strained his muscles, bracing his hands to stand tall, but his body remained pressed down by an invisible weight. An Alpha standing nearby stepped forward to assist him. But the moment his hand touched the other's shoulder, the same thing occurred. His own knees hit the stone floor with a dry thud. This time, no one laughed. Gazes began to shift from curiosity to bewilderment. The second Alpha also attempted to rise, but like the first, his body would not obey his will. Muscles tensed and veins bulged in his neck as he fought to stand, but his knees remained glued to the floor as if the very stone were holding him captive. Then a third Alpha knelt. The metal of his armor clashing against the stone echoed through the silent hall. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Idle chatter vanished. Pack leaders began to look around with mounting tension as more and more powerful warriors in the room failed to stay upright. Within just a few heartbeats, 5, then 7, then more than 10, Alphas were kneeling on the cold stone. Some tried to force themselves up, but none succeeded. Confusion spread through the crowd like a wave. One pack leader demanded to know what was happening, while another growled in fury upon realizing he could not rise despite exerting all his strength. At the back of the hall, Aria stood pressed against the stone wall, her hands still gripping the silver tray, as if it were the only thing keeping her balanced. She watched the scene before her with the same bewilderment as everyone else in the room. But what no one realized was that the throb in her chest was accelerating by the second. It was no longer a vague sensation. Each heartbeat felt like a drum echoing deep within her body, radiating a form of energy that Aria herself could not comprehend. Across the hall, Lysander Vale watched it all unfold. Since the second Alpha had buckled, a chill had been running down his spine. His gaze did not linger on the kneeling warriors, but quickly sought out Aria. He saw her breathing grow ragged. He saw her hands clenching the silver tray until her knuckles turned white. And in that moment, Lysander understood that what was happening in the hall was no random accident. Its source might be standing at the very back of the room. In the center of the hall, High Elder Cassian had lowered his ceremonial staff. His aged eyes widened as he took in the spectacle before him. The ritual had halted, and no one understood why. But while most were still confused, one Alpha suddenly turned his head. His gaze locked onto the back of the hall right where Aria was standing. He frowned as if he had just realized something, then softly whispered, "Wait." Another turned to follow his gaze. Then another. Within seconds, the eyes of every Alpha in the hall began to gravitate toward the same direction. Aria. She felt it immediately. When she looked up, dozens of eyes were staring directly at her. Her heart pounded so hard it was nearly painful. An Alpha whispered that this couldn't be happening, but at that exact moment, another sound rang out through the hall. Slow, heavy footsteps echoed clearly on the stone floor. Everyone turned their heads. Alpha King Adrian Voss had left his position. He descended from the steps of the black stone throne and entered the hall. No one spoke. Even the kneeling Alphas looked up as they watched him. Adrian Voss walked through the center of the room, as if everything around him did not exist. His sharp, cold gaze swept over the Alphas kneeling on the stone before coming to rest at the back of the hall, upon Aria. In that moment, Aria felt her entire body freeze. The Alpha King was advancing toward her, step by step. She did not understand what was happening, but instinct made her bow her head immediately. A servant like her was not permitted to look directly at the Alpha King, yet that did not stop the violent throb in her chest. The closer he drew, the stronger the strange sensation in her body became, like two powers, recognizing one another after a long slumber. Finally, Adrian Voss stopped in front of her. She remained bowed, hands clenching the silver tray. She could see his black leather boots right before her. Time seemed to slow down. No one in the hall dared to breathe heavily. Then Adrian Voss moved. Before the eyes of the entire hall, the Alpha King of the Wolf Kingdom slowly dropped to one knee. The sound of his knee hitting the stone rang out clearly, and the entire room went deathly silent. No one spoke. No one moved. Dozens of Alphas kneeling on the floor watched the scene with utter disbelief. For what had just happened had never occurred in the history of the Wolf Kingdom. An Alpha King had knelt, and he had knelt before an Omega. Aria looked up reflexively. When her eyes met Adrian Voss's, she saw an absolute certainty in his gaze. It was not the coldness of a king, nor the look of a warrior assessing an opponent. It was the gaze of a man who had recognized something that the others still failed to understand. Adrian Voss's deep voice rang out amidst the silent hall. He said that everyone should bow before their queen. Those words spread through the room like a thunderbolt. Several Alphas gaped in shock. Some shook their heads as if unable to believe what they had just heard. In the center of the hall, High Elder Cassian trembled. The staff in his hand shook slightly as his gaze rested on Aria. He looked at her as if he were seeing a legend stepping out from the pages of ancient books. His voice was so low it was almost a mere breath as he muttered that this couldn't be happening. But his eyes never left Aria as he whispered one more sentence, his voice trembling with awe. The Luna Queen has returned. Part 2. The Last Luna. Chapter 6. The Ancient Bloodline. For several seconds after the Alpha King's words echoed through the hall, no one moved. The entire room was plunged into a silence so heavy that even the flames on the walls seemed to stop flickering. The Alphas, kneeling on the stone floor, remained in place, their gazes fixed on Aria with undisguised bewilderment. A few attempted to stand, and this time they succeeded, but the strange sensation of what had just occurred remained etched in their eyes. Then, whispers began to ripple through the hall. A pack leader standing near the center turned to the person beside him and asked if they had just seen what he thought he had seen. Another Alpha shook his head, stating that it was impossible. A servant Omega could not make the strongest Alphas in the kingdom kneel. Yet, even as the denials rang out, no one in the room could explain what had just transpired. In the center of the hall, High Elder Cassian remained motionless. His aged gaze was fixed on Aria, as if he were staring at a secret that had slept for centuries. His hand still gripped the ceremonial staff, but he no longer recited the ancient verses. Instead, he descended a stone step slowly, his eyes never leaving the girl standing near the back wall of the hall. Aria felt her entire body tremble slightly. Dozens of eyes were watching her, making her want to vanish from the room instantly. She did not understand why the Alpha King had knelt before her. She did not even understand why the other Alphas had knelt. All she knew was that the violent throb in her chest had not yet ceased. I am not a queen, Aria said softly, her voice nearly drowned out by the rising clamor in the hall. But Alpha King Adrian Voss still stood before her. As he rose from his kneeling position, his gaze maintained the same terrifying composure as before. He looked at Aria for a few seconds, then spoke in a voice deep yet clear enough for the entire hall to hear. "You may not know who you are," he said, "but your blood knows." That statement caused the whispers in the hall to immediately grow louder. A few Alphas began to argue amongst themselves, while pack leaders looked at Aria with gazes half suspicious and half fearful. But High Elder Cassian raised his hand, signaling for silence. It took several seconds before the room returned to quiet. "Ancient legends are not fairy tales," the High Elder said, his voice ringing out deep and slow. "Many of you think the tale of the Luna dynasty is merely a myth of the old age, but the truth is, it once existed." A few Alphas looked at each other upon hearing those words. High Elder Cassian took another step down the hall, his staff clicking softly against the stone. "Before the packs were ruled by Alpha Kings," he continued, "there were Luna Queens." He paused for a second, letting those words settle in the room. "Lunas were not merely the mates of Alphas," he said. "They were the source of power that made Alphas bow. They were the ones who could unify the packs through the very instinct of the wolf." A young Alpha let out a faint chuckle, but his laughter quickly died when he realized no one else in the room was laughing. High Elder Cassian continued to speak, his gaze still fixed on Aria. "The Luna dynasty ruled the wolf world hundreds of years ago. But that bloodline vanished from this world more than 3 centuries ago. At least, that is what we all believed." He turned his head toward the Alphas who had knelt just minutes ago. "But tonight, under the blood moon, you have felt what our ancestors once knew." His gaze returned to Aria. "That bloodline still exists." Aria shook her head slightly, as if she wanted to reject everything she was hearing. She was no queen. She was not special. She was just an Omega with no pheromones, a servant who had lived in the palace for the past 3 years. "But she doesn't even have a pheromone scent," an Alpha shouted from the back of the hall. High Elder Cassian turned his head toward the speaker. "True," he replied. Then he looked back at Aria. "Because a true Luna Queen does not need to prove herself through scent." The entire hall fell silent. "An Omega's pheromones are created to attract Alphas," the High Elder continued. "But the pheromones of a Luna Queen are not for attraction." He paused for a second, but to command submission. Those words dropped into the hall like a heavy stone. People began to recall what had just happened. Dozens of Alphas had knelt, not out of fear, not out of force, but because their instinct had compelled them to bow. Aria stood still, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She did not know what to think anymore. The world she had known for 3 years seemed to be collapsing before her eyes, but High Elder Cassian was not finished. His gaze became heavier as he continued. "But if a Luna Queen has truly returned," he said slowly, "then something else will also happen." A few Alphas frowned. "What?" one asked. High Elder Cassian looked up at the high windows of the hall, where the blood moon was bathing the room in a pale red hue. "When the Luna blood awakens," he said, "those who have hunted that bloodline for centuries will also know." A chill ran down the spines of many in the room. "Who are you speaking of?" a pack leader asked. High Elder Cassian did not answer immediately. He only looked at Aria once more before speaking a name that very few in the wolf world still remembered: the Silver Council. The name fell upon the hall like an ancient curse. And in a place far from the royal palace, in a dark room filled with ancient books, a man stood before a stone table. An old book lay open before him, the ancient characters on the page beginning to glow under the red moonlight. The man looked at the book for a few seconds before smiling faintly. "Finally," he said softly, "the Luna has appeared." Chapter 7. The Prophecy. After High Elder Cassian mentioned the name of the Silver Council, the atmosphere in the hall was no longer the same as it had been moments before. The alphas who had just stood up after the kneeling phenomenon had not yet fully regained their composure. Some whispered among themselves, while others looked at Aria with gazes half suspicious and half wary. No one dared to mock the Omega girl standing near the back wall as they had before. High Elder Cassian slowly returned to the center of the ceremony. He raised his hand, signaling for everyone to remain silent once more. Although many alphas in the room still wished to argue, the royal elder's prestige was great enough to make them stop. "There is one thing that many of you have forgotten," he said, his voice deep and slow. "When the Luna dynasty still existed, the packs did not fight one another as they do today." A few pack leaders exchanged glances. The High Elder continued, his gaze sweeping across the room before halting on Aria. "The ancient texts do not only speak of the power of the Luna Queens," he said. "They also mention a prophecy." The entire hall listened. "The prophecy says that when the last Luna awakens under the blood moon, the packs will no longer be divided." An alpha frowned. "What do you mean?" High Elder Cassian answered immediately. "The last Luna will unify all the packs." Those words caused many in the room to pale. Some alphas immediately protested, stating that no Omega could rule their packs, but others remained silent. They had just witnessed something that none of them could explain. High Elder Cassian did not argue. He only turned his head toward Aria, as if he were looking at the final piece of an ancient story that had slept for too long. "But the prophecy does not only speak of unification," he continued. His gaze slowly shifted toward Alpha King Adrian Voss. "The prophecy also says that when the last Luna appears, there will be an Alpha standing by her side." The entire hall turned to look at the Alpha King. The High Elder spoke slowly, emphasizing every word. An Alpha strong enough to kneel before her and still stand up to protect her. Aria felt her heart pound harder upon hearing those words. She did not want to be the center of any prophecy. She only wanted to leave this hall as quickly as possible. But just as she thought of that, a strange sensation ran down her spine. For when she looked up, she realized that Alpha King Adrian Voss was still watching her. It was not with curiosity, but as if he had known the answer for a long time. And in that moment, Aria began to realize a terrifying truth. Perhaps he had known something about her before everyone else in this room. Chapter 8. The Alpha King's Secret. Night had blanketed the royal palace, but the blood moon still hung high in the sky, staining the ancient stone walls a pale red. After the chaos in the Great Hall, most of the alphas had departed to confer with their pack leaders. The once noisy corridors had grown quiet, occupied only by the steady footsteps of guards and the flickering light of torches along the walls. Aria stood in a small room deep within the palace's inner sanctum, a place typically reserved for special guests or interrogating those involved in significant events. The room was modest, containing only a heavy wooden table, a long bench, and a high window overlooking the courtyard. She stood near the window, hands clasped tightly over her chest, trying to process what had just transpired in the hall. The Alpha King had knelt before her. She still could not believe it. The image of Adrian Voss dropping to one knee in front of her replayed in her mind, alongside the horrified expressions of the surrounding alphas. High Elder Cassian's words also echoed in her mind like a distant resonance. "The Luna Queen has returned." Aria shook her head, trying to banish the thought. She was no queen. She was just an Omega with no pheromones, a servant who had lived in the palace for 3 years, with hardly anyone remembering her name. The sound of the door opening behind her made her startle. Alpha King Adrian Voss stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. He was no longer wearing his ceremonial cloak, dressed only in the simple black tunic of a warrior. The torchlight from the hallway illuminated his face, highlighting his familiar, sharp-edged features. In that moment, Aria realized there were only 2 of them in the room. No guards, no elders, no one but her and the most powerful man in the Wolf Kingdom. Aria immediately bowed her head by instinct, because regardless of what had happened in the hall, he was still the Alpha King. Aria kept her head down and whispered, "Alpha King, if I have done something wrong, you have done nothing wrong." Adrian's voice was deep and calm, cutting her off before she could finish. Aria looked up. "But what happened in the hall? I don't understand what happened." Adrian took a few more steps into the room, his gaze fixed on her. It was not the cold look of a king assessing a subject, but rather as if he were observing something he had watched for a very long time. "I am not a Luna," Aria said quickly, almost frantically. "I don't even have pheromones. It's all a misunderstanding." Adrian remained silent for a few seconds, then spoke a sentence that made Aria freeze. "I know." Aria blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. I know you are no ordinary Omega." She looked at him with visible confusion. "But I have suspected it for a long time." That statement plunged the room into silence once more. Aria looked at Adrian as if he had just said something entirely nonsensical. She had lived in the palace for 3 years, working as a servant whom no one noticed. No Alpha cared about her, except for those who wished to mock her weakness. Why would the Alpha King have noticed her? "Since when?" Aria asked softly. Adrian did not answer immediately. He walked toward the wooden table, placing his hand on its surface as if contemplating how to begin. "From the day you arrived at the palace," he finally spoke. Aria went still. 3 years ago," Adrian continued, "a young Omega was brought to the palace gates. A girl with no pheromone scent, no pack, and no one knew where she came from." Aria remembered that day vividly. The old man who had brought her to the gates said this was the only place that could protect her. Then he vanished before she could ask anything more. "I saw you for the first time in the courtyard," Adrian said. "You stood among the other servants, bowing your head as if you wanted to vanish from the world." Aria did not remember that moment, but Adrian did. "The first thing I noticed," he said slowly, "was that you had no pheromones." Aria let out a dry laugh. That wasn't hard to notice. "No," Adrian said. "What made me suspicious was the instinctive reaction of the wolf within me." Aria frowned. Adrian looked directly into her eyes. "It reacted to you." Aria shook her head. "But that is impossible, if I have no pheromones." "You think you have no pheromones," Adrian interrupted. He took a step closer, his gaze steady but deeper than before. "But you have never actually smelled them." Aria stared at him, not following his meaning. Adrian continued, his voice lowering. "Your pheromones never disappeared." He paused for a second. It was only sealed. That sentence left Aria speechless. "Sealed." Adrian nodded slightly. "Luna pheromones are rare, and very powerful. If they were fully awakened, any alpha nearby would sense them." He looked toward the window, where the blood moon cast its glow into the room. "The Silver Council has ways of tracking that kind of pheromone," he said. Aria felt a chill run down her spine at the mention of that name. "So, someone locked it away," Adrian said, "so that no one could find you." Aria took a step back, her mind reeling. All those years she had lived thinking she was a defective Omega, that her body lacked the very thing that made her part of the wolf world, were not the truth. "You were never without pheromones," Adrian said softly. "They were just hidden, to keep you alive." The room was silent. Aria tried to take a deep breath, but her heart was pounding so fast it made her thoughts chaotic. "Then why did all of this happen today?" she asked. Adrian looked up at the red sky outside the window. "The blood moon," he said. "The only night of the year when ancient seals grow weak." Aria didn't know what to say. Everything she believed about herself for 20 years was collapsing. Then Adrian asked a question that made her lift her head. "The man who brought you to the palace, who was he?" Aria blinked. "An old man. Do you know his name?" She shook her head. "No. He only said the palace was the only place that could protect me." Adrian was silent for a few seconds. Then his expression shifted. A realization seemed to dawn on him, a slow light appearing in his eyes. "So they found you," he said. Aria frowned. "Who?" Adrian didn't answer. He only looked at her for a long moment. "You think you came to the palace by chance," he said, "but you didn't." Aria felt a sense of unease spread through her chest. "What are you saying?" Adrian took another step closer. "The man who brought you to the palace gates 3 years ago," he paused, "was my man." Aria was stunned. "I ordered him to find you," Adrian said. Aria's heart seemed to stop. "I don't understand." Adrian looked at her in silence for a long time. Then he spoke the final words that changed Aria's world once again. "You did not come to the palace because of fate," he said. "You came here because I searched for you." He paused for a heartbeat and added one more thing. "I have been waiting for you." Chapter 9. Enemies in the Shadows. The blood moon still hung, suspended in the sky as the events within the royal palace began to ripple out into the world. The Alphas left the hall with heavy expressions, carrying stories that they themselves were not certain they had just witnessed. Rumors spread faster than any messenger. Within mere hours, throughout the palace corridors, across the barracks, and among the pack entourages staying outside the city walls, people had begun to whisper about the same thing. The Alpha King had knelt before an Omega, but those whispers did not stop within the palace. Far from the lands of the royal pack, beyond the black forests and the valleys where few wolves dared to tread, stood an ancient fortress hidden deep among jagged cliffs. Its stone walls had existed since the era when packs fought one another in ancient wars. No flag of any pack flew there, and no one in the Wolf Kingdom mentioned it in daily conversation. But in the oldest of books, that place had a name, the Silver Council. Inside a great chamber of the fortress, torchlight illuminated walls filled with ancient symbols. A long stone table sat at the center of the room, and around it stood men draped in silver cloaks. None of them spoke loudly. They simply stood there in silence, as if waiting for something. At the head of the stone table, an elderly man leaned over an ancient book. The pages had yellowed with time, and the archaic characters written in silver ink glowed faintly under the firelight. The man placed his hand upon the page, his gaze sweeping over the lines of text as if he had read them hundreds of times before. Then, suddenly, the characters on the page began to shift, a pale red light spreading from the center of the book. The man paused, and the room grew even quieter. One of those in silver cloaks stepped closer. "My lord." The elderly man did not answer immediately. He only stared at the glowing page before him. The ancient characters were shifting, rearranging themselves into a new line of text. When he finished reading, a very small smile appeared on his lips. "Finally," he said softly. The others in the room looked at one another. "What have you found?" one asked. The elderly man slowly raised his head. His gaze was cold and sharp as a blade. "The Luna bloodline has awakened." Those words made several in the room stiffen. Another man stepped toward the stone table. "That is impossible. We destroyed that bloodline hundreds of years ago." The elder shook his head slightly. "That is what we thought." He softly closed the book. "But tonight the blood moon has confirmed what we feared most." He turned and looked at those standing around the table. "The last Luna is still alive." The room fell silent. Then a younger man asked what they were all thinking. "Where is she?" The elderly man did not answer immediately. He walked slowly toward the narrow window of the fortress, where the blood moon could be seen hanging in the night sky. "Closer than we think," he said. He turned back to look at the others. The royal palace. A wave of tension spread through the room. One of the silver-cloaked men said that if the Luna had truly appeared in the royal palace, then it meant the Alpha King had seen her before they did. The elderly man nodded. "Perhaps." He paused for a second before adding, "But that changes nothing." His gaze grew colder. "The Luna bloodline is not permitted to exist." He placed his hand on the stone table. "Prepare the hunters." One asked if they should attack the palace immediately. The elder shook his head. "No." His voice was calm, yet dangerous. "We do not hunt the Luna like we hunt a beast." He turned his head toward the moonlight outside the window. "We watch." He smiled faintly. "And when the time comes," his eyes grew darker, "we will kill her." Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away from the fortress, Aria still stood in the small room of the royal palace, struggling to understand the words Adrian had just told her. She did not know that in a very distant place, those who had hunted her bloodline for centuries had just realized she was still alive, and they had begun the hunt once more. Chapter 10. Awakening Power. After the night of the blood moon, the royal palace was no longer as quiet as it had been. Rumors of the event in the great hall continued to ripple through the corridors and barracks, but within the deepest inner sanctum of the palace, everything had become unusually silent. Adrian understood clearly that if what High Elder Cassian said was true, then Aria could no longer continue to live as an invisible servant. If the power within her blood had begun to awaken, then she needed to understand it before it controlled her. So the following morning, Adrian took Aria away from the inner sanctum and led her to a place where very few were permitted to enter the secluded training grounds situated behind the northern wall of the palace. The area was surrounded by high stone walls and ancient trees, making sounds from the outside nearly impossible to penetrate. This was where the elite warriors of the royal pack trained, but on that morning, Adrian had ordered everyone to leave. Only a few loyal alphas remained, standing far off at the edge of the yard. Aria stood in the center of the vast grounds, feeling the chill morning breeze brush through her hair. She looked around with uncertainty. Everything had happened so fast since last night that she was still unaccustomed to the fact that people who once ignored her now looked at her with cautious eyes. "What did you bring me here for?" Aria asked softly. Adrian stood a few paces from her, arms crossed over his chest. His gaze was no longer as cold as it had been in the Great Hall, yet it maintained the familiar composure of an Alpha King. "To see what actually happened last night," he said. Aria shook her head slightly. "I told you. I don't know why they knelt." "I know." Adrian's voice was deep but certain. "But you need to see it for yourself." Aria frowned. "Do you think I can make them kneel again?" Adrian did not answer. Instead, he signaled to the 3 alphas standing at the edge of the training grounds to draw closer. They were the most loyal warriors of the royal pack, men who had served Adrian for years and were not easily subdued by anyone. The 3 alphas stopped a few paces from Aria. The air in the training grounds grew heavy. Aria turned to Adrian. "What do you want me to do?" "Nothing," Adrian said. "Just stand there." She looked at him with skepticism, but complied nonetheless. For the first few seconds, nothing happened. The 3 alphas stood still, their gazes fixed on Aria with obvious caution. Aria also felt nothing other than her own heart beating slightly fast from tension. "See," she said after a moment. "There is nothing." Adrian did not move. "Don't try," he said. "Just feel." Aria took a deep breath. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, trying to recall the sensation in the hall last night. Her heartbeat, the blood moon, and the strange pressure spreading through the room. At first, nothing happened. Then her heartbeat began to grow stronger, not out of fear, but because a familiar sensation was returning. Aria opened her eyes. The surrounding air seemed to grow thicker. One of the 3 alphas swayed slightly. He immediately clenched his jaw, trying to keep his balance. The second alpha frowned, as if he had just felt an invisible pressure. Aria looked at them with confusion. "What?" Her sentence cut off midway as the first alpha buckled to the ground. The sound of a knee hitting the stone floor rang out clearly. Aria startled. The second alpha tried to step back, but his body would not obey his will. A second later, he too knelt. The final alpha tried to resist longer. The muscles in his arms tensed, but finally, his knees also touched the earth. All 3 powerful warriors of the royal pack were kneeling before Aria. She took a step back, heart pounding in her chest. "No, I didn't do anything." Adrian stepped closer, but his gaze held no surprise. "You did," he said. Aria looked at the 3 alphas kneeling before her, panic clear on her face. "I didn't want them to kneel." "I know." Aria took a deep breath, struggling to calm herself. Her heartbeat slowed. A few seconds later, the invisible pressure in the training grounds vanished. The 3 alphas before her exhaled heavily and then slowly stood up. None of them spoke, but the way they looked at Aria had changed completely. No longer was there doubt, only an instinctive reverence they could not explain. Aria turned to Adrian, still not entirely calm. Was it really me?" Adrian looked at her in silence for a long time before nodding slightly. "This is only the beginning." Aria looked down at her hands, as if they had just become something foreign. For years, she thought she was the weakest person in the palace, but now, for the first time in her life, she began to realize that perhaps she was never as weak as she thought. She lifted her head, her gaze no longer as panicked as before. "Then I must learn to control it," she said. Adrian nodded. "And you will." In that moment, Adrian realized one thing. The girl who used to bow her head and avoid every gaze in the palace was disappearing. In her place, someone else was gradually emerging, a true Luna, and if that were true, then their time was running out. Because at the northern border of the territory, a messenger was riding at full speed toward the palace. As he burst through the city gates, the guards immediately recognized the signs of emergency on his armor. He jumped off his horse and ran straight into the courtyard. "Urgent report," A gasped. Adrian turned his head as the soldier knelt before him. The northern border outpost was just attacked. Adrian narrowed his eyes. "Which pack?" The soldier shook his head. "Not a pack." He took a deep breath before continuing. "They wore silver cloaks." Part 3, Queen of the Wolves. Chapter 11. The betrayal. News from the northern outpost spread through the palace faster than any command from the Alpha King. Guards were reinforced at every gate. Patrols were dispatched into the forests, and the atmosphere within the palace grew as tense as the air before a great storm. Although no one dared to speak aloud, the name of the Silver Council had begun to appear in whispered conversations between warriors and elders. Aria also sensed that change. After the trial in the training grounds, Adrian had ordered her to temporarily remain within the inner sanctum, the most heavily guarded area of the palace. But even within those quiet stone corridors, she could feel something shifting beyond the thick walls of the castle. It was not just fear, but a sensation, as if the entire wolf world was gradually revolving around her. That afternoon, Aria left her room to walk along a narrow corridor leading to the garden behind the palace. Previously, she often came to this place when she wanted to escape the mocking glares of the other alphas. The garden was quiet, filled only with the sound of the wind and the rustling of ancient trees. But today she did not come to hide. She needed space to think. The words Adrian spoke in the training grounds still rang in her head. The power of the Luna, the sealed pheromones, the Silver Council, all of it seemed too vast for someone who had lived as an invisible Omega in the palace like her. As Aria stepped through the stone gate leading into the garden, she realized she was not the only one there. A man was standing near the stone wall in the distance. He turned when he heard her footsteps. Lysander. Aria recognized him immediately. Lysander Vale was one of the young alphas of the palace, one of the rare few who had never joined in the mockery against her during the past 3 years. He did not speak much, but every time Aria had to bring water or food into the great hall, she always felt his gaze observing the surroundings, as if ensuring no one made things difficult for her. Lysander bowed his head slightly upon seeing her. "Luna," he said. Aria immediately shook her head. "Don't call me that." Lysander smiled faintly. The entire palace saw what happened in the great hall. Aria stepped closer. "Do you believe in it too?" Lysander looked at her for a few seconds before answering. "I believe in what I saw." Aria did not know what to say. For 3 years, Lysander had always been one of the few who did not treat her like a joke. So as he stood before her now, Aria felt a rare bit of relief amidst all the changes around her. "The palace is preparing for war," Lysander said softly. "Because of the Silver Council," Lysander nodded. "The Alpha King has ordered a reinforcement of the defenses." Aria looked down at the stones beneath her feet. "All of this is happening, just because of me." Lysander shook his head. "No." He looked directly into her eyes. "Because of what you represent." Aria did not answer immediately. A light breeze blew through the garden, making the ancient canopies quiver. "Are you not afraid?" Lysander asked after a moment. Aria thought for a while before answering. "Yes," she lifted her head. "But I don't want to run away anymore." In that moment, Lysander looked at her with an unreadable gaze. Then he nodded slightly. "That is why they fear you." Aria was about to ask him who they were, but just then, a strange sensation ran down her spine. Her heartbeat suddenly accelerated, not out of fear, but because of a familiar sensation she had begun to recognize since the night of the blood moon. A tension in the air. Aria turned her head, and the moment she did, Lysander moved. His movement was so fast that Aria did not have time to react. In 1 second, he stood before her. In the next, his blade was pressed against her throat. Aria froze. Lysander held her still with one hand, the cold silver blade pressed against her skin. "Don't move," he said softly. His voice no longer held the gentleness of a few minutes ago. It was cold and entirely foreign. Aria looked at him with disbelief. "Lysander." He looked directly into her eyes. "I'm sorry." The stone gate behind the garden opened, and 3 men stepped in. They wore silver cloaks. Aria felt her heart pound in her chest as she recognized the symbol on their cloaks. Silver Council. One of the men drew closer, his cold gaze halting on Aria. "Well done," he said to Lysander. "We have waited for this moment for a long time." Aria looked at Lysander. "You work for them." Lysander did not answer. He only tightened the blade a little more. The man in the silver cloak took another step. "The last Luna," he said slowly. "Our hunt finally ends." Chapter 12. Attack of the Silver Council. The moment the silver blade touched Aria's neck, the entire garden behind the royal palace seemed to plunge into a frigid silence. Wind swept through the canopies of ancient trees, carrying the familiar metallic scent of silver, the only weapon wolf hunters believed could kill a Luna. Aria stood motionless, sensing Lysander's breath right behind her. Only minutes ago, He had been the only person in the palace who made her feel she was not entirely alone. But now, his hand gripped her arm firmly, and the silver blade in his hand reflected the red light of the blood moon. 3 men in silver cloaks stepped deeper into the garden. Ancient symbols carved onto their cloaks shimmered under the moonlight, and with a single glance, Aria knew they were no ordinary warriors. The way they moved, the way their gaze halted on her, all exuded the cold patience of those who had hunted the same prey for centuries. The man in the lead stopped a few paces from Aria. He was not in a hurry, as if certain his prey no longer had a path to escape. "The last Luna," he said, his voice deep and calm. "Our hunt finally ends." Aria could not take her eyes off Lysander. She had not yet fully accepted what had just happened. "Were you working for them from the start?" she asked softly. Lysander did not answer immediately. The blade in his hand remained pressed against her neck, but his gaze wavered for a very brief moment. "I'm sorry," he finally spoke. The man in the silver cloak took another step. "Do not waste time. We must leave here before the Alpha King realizes." The 2 remaining hunters began to close in on Aria. They drew out thin silver chains, the kind specifically crafted to bind shape-shifting wolves. Aria felt her heart pound in her chest, not out of fear but because of a familiar sensation surging within her body. She did not know what to do. Right then, a sound erupted, a roar. Not the roar of a human, but the roar of a wolf. The sound echoed from the garden gate, deep and fierce to the point that the surrounding air seemed to vibrate along with it. The hunters of the Silver Council immediately turned their heads. A second later, the stone gate leading into the garden was thrown open. Adrian stepped in. He was not in wolf form, but the alpha instinct within him was so potent it made the surrounding air grow heavy. Behind him was a group of royal pack warriors, many of whom had begun to partially shift, claws lengthening and eyes turning the amber yellow of the wolf kind. Adrian's gaze halted immediately upon Aria. Then it shifted to Lysander. "Let her go," Adrian said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of an alpha command. Lysander did not budge. The man in the silver cloak smiled faintly. "Alpha King Adrian Voss, I wondered how long it would take before you found us." Adrian took another step into the garden, long enough to know you have made a mistake. "Oh," the other man raised an eyebrow. "You have entered my territory." The moment the sentence finished, the battle exploded. One of the royal pack warriors lunged first, his body transforming completely into wolf form mid-air. A silver council hunter swung a silver sword to block him, sparks flying as metal clashed with claws. Lysander pulled Aria back a few paces as chaos began to spread throughout the garden. Aria tried to break free, but he held her tighter. "Don't make this more difficult," he said. "You are handing me over to them," Aria replied. Lysander's gaze darkened slightly. "It is the only way to keep you alive." But his sentence was cut short when Adrian appeared before them as fast as the wind. In a single movement, Adrian struck the blade from Lysander's hand and pulled Aria toward him. She collided with his chest, and in that moment, she clearly felt his warmth, along with the powerful pheromones of the Alpha King, the scent of dark wood and smoke. Aria had never been this close to him. Her heart beat faster. Adrian kept her behind him as Lysander retreated a few paces. "I trusted you," Adrian said, his voice low and dangerous. Lysander did not respond. His gaze shifted to the 3 Silver Council hunters, as if waiting for the next command. The battle around them continued fiercely. 2 royal pack warriors had fully shifted into wolves, lunging at the silver-cloaked hunters. But the hunters were not weak. They fought with long silver blades and arrows dipped in poison. A pack warrior collapsed as a silver arrow pierced his shoulder. Right then, Aria felt a sharp pain in her chest. She took a sharp breath. "Someone is hurt," she whispered. Adrian turned his head to look at her. "At the north gate," Aria said, her voice trembling slightly. "They are being attacked." Adrian frowned. A second later, a guard ran into the garden, gasping for breath. Alpha King. The northern patrol was ambushed. Adrian looked at Aria. For the first time, he realized what had just happened. She had sensed it before anyone reported it. Pack bond. The battle in the garden reached its peak. Adrian downed a hunter with a powerful blow, but the leader of the Silver Council signaled a retreat. "Enough," he said. The 2 remaining hunters quickly retreated behind him. He looked at Aria one last time. "The Luna has awakened," he said. His gaze shifted to Adrian. "But you cannot protect her forever." Then they vanished into the darkness behind the garden wall. Silence gradually returned. Adrian turned to Aria. She was still standing very close to him, You could be killed because of me, she said softly. Adrian looked at her for a few seconds. I will kill the entire world before letting that happen. Aria did not know how to respond. Adrian placed his hand on her shoulder. From now on, you will not leave my side. Is that an Alpha King's command? Aria asked. Adrian shook his head slightly. No. His gaze deepened. It is the promise of the one who will protect you. But just as those words were uttered, another roar echoed from the forest outside the palace. Not one wolf, but dozens. Aria turned toward the dark forest, and in that moment, she realized something that made her heart grow cold. Those wolves were coming. Chapter 13. The Hidden Truth. The night following the Silver Council's attack plunged the entire palace into an unprecedented state of alert. Torches burned all along the stone corridors. Guards were reinforced at every gate, and the warriors of the royal pack patrolled ceaselessly around the ancient walls. Although the battle in the garden had ended, no one in the palace truly believed the danger had passed. The Silver Council was not the kind of enemy to appear and then vanish. They hunted with patience, and once a hunt began, they would not stop until the prey fell. Aria stood before a cell door deep within the stone levels of the palace. The air here was colder than elsewhere, and the firelight from the torches mounted on the walls cast long shadows across the stone floor. Adrian stood directly behind her, arms crossed over his chest, his gaze as cold as a suppressed storm. High Elder Cassian was also present, his ancient staff tapping softly against the floor each time he took a step. Inside the cell was Lysander. He sat leaning against the stone wall, both hands bound by silver chains, the kind designed to restrict an alpha's power. The torchlight shone upon his face, highlighting a small cut on his cheek and the quiet gaze of a man who had accepted his fate. Aria entered the room first, the iron door closing behind her with a heavy metallic ring. Lysander lifted his head when he heard her footsteps. For a brief moment, his eyes met Aria's. There was no defiance in them, nor any obvious regret, only a strange composure. Aria, he said. His voice was deep and hoarse after the battle. Adrian entered after her, standing a few paces from Lysander. The Alpha King's gaze was sharp as a blade. You will tell the truth, Adrian said. Right now. Lysander looked at Adrian, then back at Aria. I always knew this day would come, he said softly. Aria stood still for several seconds before asking the question she had not dared to ask since the battle ended. How long have you been working for them? Lysander did not answer immediately. Almost my entire life, he finally said. The air in the room grew heavy. Adrian took another step. The Silver Council planted you in the palace. No, Lysander said. They sent me. To kill the Luna, Adrian asked. Lysander shook his head slightly. No, he looked directly at Aria. To find her. Aria frowned. What do you mean? Lysander exhaled slowly. The Silver Council has hunted the Luna bloodline for centuries. But the last Luna vanished from the wolf world before they could find her. He paused for a second. Until 20 years ago. Aria felt her heart pound in her chest. You are talking about me, Lysander nodded. I was raised within the Silver Council. Since I was a child, I was taught that the Luna was the greatest danger to the order of the wolf world. Our mission was to find and destroy. High Elder Cassian slightly tightened his grip on his staff. But you did not kill her when you had the chance, he said. Lysander looked at Aria once more. I never wanted to kill her. That statement silenced the room. Adrian narrowed his eyes. Then why did you hand her over to the Silver Council? Lysander closed his eyes for a brief moment. When the Luna awakens, the Silver Council will sense it. No matter what I did, they would come. He opened his eyes again. At least if they came through me, I could still control what happened. Aria shook her head slightly. You said it was the only way to keep me alive. Yes. Lysander looked down at the stone floor. The Silver Council does not want to kill you immediately. Aria whispered. Then what do they want? Lysander paused for a few seconds before answering. They want the Luna power. Those words caused Adrian to tighten his hand. High Elder Cassian looked at Lysander with a heavy gaze. You are speaking of the ancient ritual. Lysander nodded. The ritual can only be performed once the Luna reaches maturity, and when her power has awakened. Aria felt her breathing grow heavy. All the memories of her childhood began to return. The small house in the forest, the evenings by the hearth. The man who always said the world outside was very dangerous. The head of the Silver Council, Aria said softly. Who is he? Lysander looked at her in silence. Then he said the thing Aria had begun to fear since Cassian first mentioned it. The man who raised you. The air in the room seemed to stop moving. Aria shook her head. No. But Lysander continued, "He is not your father." His voice dropped. "He is the man who found you when you were a child." High Elder Cassian took a step forward, and he hid you from the world. "No," Lysander said. "He hid her from everyone else, to keep her for himself." Aria felt as if her heart were being squeezed. "He raised me. Yes. He taught me to read. Yes. He said the world outside was dangerous." Lysander looked at her. That was not a lie. Aria closed her eyes. A memory suddenly surfaced in her mind. An evening many years ago, when that man placed his hand on her shoulder and said that one day she would understand why he had to keep her away from the world. Aria opened her eyes. "He knew I was the Luna." Lysander nodded. "He always knew." Aria whispered, "Then why didn't he kill me?" Lysander answered in a deep, heavy voice, "Because a Luna must reach maturity." He paused for a second before continuing, "And because the Luna's power can only be taken when she is fully awakened." The room fell into silence. At that exact moment, a raven beat its wings against the high window of the cell. A guard entered seconds later, carrying a slip of paper tied with a red string. "Alpha King," he said. Adrian took the paper and opened it. His gaze darkened as he read the lines. Aria looked at him. "What is it?" Adrian handed her the paper. There was only one line written in silver ink. "Bring the Luna to the Blood Moon Forest, or all the Pax will die." Chapter 14. The Last Luna Queen. The message from the Silver Council plunged the entire palace into an atmosphere as heavy as the air before a storm. The slip of paper with silver lettering remained on the stone table in the inner sanctum's meeting room, where Aria, Adrian, and High Elder Cassian stood. None of them spoke for the first few seconds after reading it, but that silence was not because they failed to grasp the meaning of the threat. The Silver Council was not just targeting Aria, they were targeting the entire wolf world. Aria stood before the stone table, her gaze lingering on the final line of the letter. All the Pax will die. Her heart pounded in her chest. But for the first time since everything began, fear was no longer the strongest emotion within her. Instead, there was a clarity as cold as ice. "We have no choice," Aria said softly. Adrian immediately turned to look at her. "No, just one word." But his voice was powerful enough to make the entire room vibrate. "You are not going." Aria turned to face him. "If I don't go, they will continue to attack the Pax. I will find a way to protect the Pax. You cannot protect everyone." Adrian clenched his jaw. "I am the Alpha King. I will. And I am the reason they are coming," Aria interrupted. Silence fell upon the room. High Elder Cassian watched both of them with a heavy gaze. He had lived long enough to recognize when a decision was inevitable. Aria took another step toward Adrian. "If they want the Luna, then they will not stop until they have me." Adrian looked at her for a long time. His gaze darkened like a suppressed storm. "I will not let you go alone," he said. Aria was slightly surprised by that answer. "Because I am the Pax Luna." Adrian shook his head. "No." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Because you are the one I cannot lose." That statement left Aria unable to answer immediately. She looked into his eyes, and in that moment, she realized something she had never dared to think before. Adrian Voss, the Alpha King of the entire Wolf Kingdom, was not just protecting her out of duty, he was protecting her. For her. High Elder Cassian let out a small cough, breaking the moment. "If you intend to go to the Blood Moon Forest, we do not have much time." Adrian turned back to him. "Prepare the elite warriors." "No," Aria said. Both men looked at her. "The Silver Council wants me," she said. "If we bring an entire army there, they will only kill more people." Adrian looked at her with a look of disapproval. "Do you think I will let you walk into their trap alone?" Aria took one step closer to him. "No." She looked directly into his eyes. "I think you will stand beside me." A brief silence passed. Then Adrian nodded. "I always stand beside you." Hours later, the blood moon was high in the sky as Aria and Adrian left the northern gate of the palace. Only a small group of warriors followed them at a distance, enough to support if needed, but not enough to turn the trip into a military march. The path leading into the Blood Moon Forest was dark and quiet. Tall, ancient trees rose like black stone pillars under the red moonlight. Aria could clearly feel her heartbeat as they ventured deeper into the woods. This was exactly where the Silver Council wanted her to be. As they neared a clearing in the forest, Adrian suddenly reached out his hand to hold her back. "Wait!" Aria turned to look at him. Adrian was standing very close, the red moonlight reflecting in his golden eyes. "If things do not go as planned," he began. Aria shook her head. They will. Adrian placed his hand on her cheek. The movement was so gentle it made Aria freeze. I have fought hundreds of battles, he said softly. I have been ready to die many times. He paused for a second. But I have never been afraid, until you appeared. Aria felt her heart beat faster. Adrian. He did not let her finish the sentence. He leaned down and kissed her. The kiss was brief, but enough to make the world around them seem to stop. When he pulled back, Aria could still feel his warmth on her lips. Now we go, Adrian said. Aria nodded. They stepped into the forest clearing, and the Silver Council was already waiting. 3 hunters in silver cloaks stood in a circle around an ancient stone table at the center of the clearing. Ancient symbols carved into the stone surface glowed faintly under the moonlight, but the man standing before the table was not one of those 3. He stood with his back turned as Aria and Adrian entered. His long silver hair fell over his shoulders, and his black cloak swayed slightly in the night wind. When he turned around, Aria felt her breath stop. That face. She knew that face. Father, she whispered. The man smiled, not the warm smile Aria remembered from her childhood years, but a cold smile. I wondered how long it would take before you realized, he said. Adrian stepped in front of Aria by instinct. You are the head of the Silver Council. The man tilted his head slightly. Titles are not important. His gaze shifted to Aria. What matters is, you have come. Aria looked at him, hundreds of memories racing through her mind at once. The evenings by the hearth, the stories he told about wolves, the warnings that the world outside was very dangerous. You raised me, Aria said. True. To kill me. The man shook his head. No. He stepped down from the stone table. I raised you, for this day to happen. The 3 Silver Council hunters stepped back, letting the clearing open up between Aria and the man who had once been her father. The Luna must reach maturity, he said. The Luna's power must awaken. His eyes lit up under the blood moon. And now, it has happened. Just as he finished speaking, howls rang out from deep in the forest. 1, then 2, then dozens. Aria turned her head toward the darkness between the trees. Wolves stepped out, not just a few, but an entire pack. They approached the edge of the clearing, their golden eyes reflecting the moonlight. Not one growled, not one attacked. Instead, one by one, they bowed their heads. Aria felt a surge of power run through her body. Her heartbeat synchronized with the howling of the wolves. She did not give a command, yet they still bowed. Behind her, Adrian clearly felt the pressure of the alpha instinct within him. It urged him to kneel before the Luna, but he remained standing tall not because he resisted the instinct, but because he chose to stand beside her. Aria took a step forward. The wolves retreated in unison, forming a circle around her. The man in the black cloak watched the scene with glowing eyes. Finally, he whispered, "The Luna Queen has awakened." His gaze shifted to Adrian. "And now, we shall see whether the Alpha King can protect her from her fate." The Silver Council hunters drew silver swords from their cloaks. The wolves in the forest began to growl, and under the blood moon, the final battle began. Chapter 15. The King Kneels. The clearing in the blood moon forest fell into a brief silence before the battle truly exploded. The blood moon hung high in the sky like a giant red eye watching over everything. Wind blew through the ancient canopies, causing dry leaves to scatter across the ground, and within the dark circle in the heart of the forest, 2 forces stood facing one another. On one side was the Silver Council, on the other, the Luna. Hunters in silver cloaks stepped forward, the silver blades in their hands reflecting the blood-red moonlight. Ancient symbols carved into the blades began to glow faintly as they moved signs of weapons specifically forged to kill the creatures of the wolf kind. Aria's foster father stood behind them, his eyes lighting up with a cold excitement. "Do you see?" he said to those beside him. "This is the power of the Luna." His gaze halted on Aria. "I have waited 20 years for this moment." Adrian took a step forward, his body leaning slightly as a wolf prepares to lunge at its prey. "You will not have her." Aria's foster father chuckled softly. "I did not come to ask for permission, Alpha King." He raised his hand. Immediately, the Silver Council hunters charged. The battle began in the blink of an eye. One of the hunters swung a silver sword toward Adrian, but the prowess of an Alpha King was faster. He dodged to the side and landed a heavy blow to the attacker's chest. The force so great the man was hurled backward. But the Silver Council hunters were no ordinary warriors. They had been trained to hunt the strongest wolves. A silver blade grazed Adrian's shoulder, leaving a deep gash. Dark red blood dripped onto the ground. Simultaneously, The wolves in the forest began to howl. Aria stood in the center of their circle, clearly sensing the vibration of instinct within her body. Her heartbeat synchronized with the breathing of the surrounding wolves. For the first time in her life, she did not feel small in this world. She felt she belonged to it. A Silver Council hunter lunged toward her, silver sword raised high. But before the blade could touch her, a large wolf leaped from the shadows and tackled the man to the ground. Other wolves immediately swarmed in, growling and surrounding him. Aria's foster father watched the scene with glowing eyes. "Yes," he whispered. "Show me your power." He stepped down from the rock and approached Aria. "Do you know why I raised you?" Aria looked at him, her gaze calmer than ever before. "You already said it," she replied. "For this day to happen." "No." He shook his head slightly. "I raised you to prove that the Luna is merely a tool." He raised his hand, and from behind the trees, more Silver Council hunters emerged. They carried silver arrows and chains engraved with ancient symbols. "And when I take your power," he said, "I will control the entire wolfkind." Adrian roared and lunged toward him, but a hunter blocked him. A silver blade sank deep into Adrian's shoulder as he struck the attacker down. The wound caused him to falter for a second, and in combat, a second is more than enough. A silver arrow flew through the air, embedding itself in Adrian's chest. Aria felt as if her heart were being squeezed. The pain in her chest exploded. It was not just her own pain. It merged with the pain of the entire pack, the pack bond. Aria stepped quickly toward Adrian as he dropped to one knee. His breathing heavy, blood flowed down his arm, dripping onto the earth. "Adrian," she called out. Her foster father watched the scene with satisfaction. "This is the moment I have waited for," he said. But he had miscalculated one thing. Aria was no longer the weak Omega girl he had raised in the small house in the woods. She was the Luna. A powerful surge of energy erupted from Aria's body. It was not light or fire, but an invisible pressure that spread throughout the forest. The wolves around her immediately bowed their heads low. The alphas of the royal pack at the forest's edge also froze. Their instinct recognized what had previously only existed in legend, the Luna Queen. Aria stepped in front of Adrian. "You were wrong," she said. Her foster father narrowed his eyes. "I was wrong. You thought the Luna was a tool." Aria looked around the forest, the wolves, the alphas, the warriors standing behind her. But a Luna does not rule through fear. She took another step. The wolves advanced in unison with her. "She has fully awakened," a hunter screamed. Aria's foster father gripped the silver sword in his hand and charged toward her. But before he could reach her, Lysander appeared. He blocked his path. Their swords clashed, silver sparks flying in the darkness. "You," the man roared. Lysander looked at him with a steadfast gaze. "The hunt is over." While they fought, Aria knelt beside Adrian. Blood still flowed from the wound on his chest. "You must not die," she said softly. Adrian looked at her, his breathing heavy but his gaze as sharp as before. "I told you," he whispered. "I will stand beside you." Aria placed her hand on his chest. Tears rolled quickly down her cheeks onto the wound on Adrian's shoulder. He suddenly felt a surge of warmth and strange power fill his chest, running through his entire body. The wolves around them howled. Another power spread from her, not a pressure that made alphas kneel, but a connection deeper, stronger, and warmer. It made the royal pack warriors feel their strength rising like a powerful wave. Cassian stood at the edge of the forest, his eyes wide. "This is the true power of the Luna. When the Luna awakens, her pack will not easily fall," he whispered. The battle quickly ended after that. The wolves and the alphas lunged together at the Silver Council. The silver hunters were gradually overwhelmed. Finally, Aria's foster father collapsed in the heart of the Blood Moon forest. Silence returned. The wolves stood in a circle around Aria. The alphas of the royal pack also knelt, one by one, but this time, Aria did not look at them. She looked at Adrian. He too forced himself onto one knee before her, his breath still weak but gradually stabilizing. Their eyes met under the blood moon. Adrian slowly bowed his head, not out of instinct, but because of his choice. "My Luna Queen," he said softly. Aria placed her hand on his shoulder. "Stand up." Adrian lifted his head. "I do not need a king to kneel before me," Aria said. She looked at him, her voice soft but certain. "I need someone to stand beside me." Adrian stood up. The alphas around them remained kneeling. The wolves still bowed their heads, but Adrian only looked at Aria. A very small smile appeared on his lips. Then he spoke a sentence that silenced the entire forest. The whole world may kneel before you. He stepped to stand beside her. But I will always stand beside you. Bonus chapter, Night of the Luna Queen. The night following the battle, the Blood Moon Forest finally returned to tranquility. The moon remained crimson, but the roars and the clashing of metal had vanished. Only the wind blowing through the ancient canopies and the scent of damp earth remained after the struggle. Inside the palace, Aria sat beside the stone bed in the Alpha King's private chambers. Adrian lay there, his shoulder and chest bound in white linens. The silver arrow had been extracted from his wound hours ago. But even High Elder Cassian admitted that Adrian was stabilizing and recovering faster than anyone he had ever seen. It was not merely because he was a powerful alpha, but because of Aria. Aria set the medicine bowl on the table and replaced the bandages on Adrian's chest. As her fingers brushed his warm skin, she could clearly feel the familiar surge of energy flowing through her body. The Luna power. Cassian had explained to her hours ago that the power did not heal directly. Instead, it ensured that her pack would not easily fall. Adrian winced slightly as Aria tied the final layer of bandages. "You should rest," she said softly. Adrian opened his eyes to look at her. "I am resting." Aria let out a soft sigh. "You just tried to stand up 10 minutes ago." "I only wanted to make sure the palace was still standing." "The palace is still here," Aria replied. She sat down beside the bed. The golden candlelight flickered across her face, and Adrian realized that for the first time since he met her, Aria no longer looked like the small Omega girl who used to bow her head in the great hall. She looked like a queen. Yet, as her gaze met his, there was a softness that made it impossible for him to look away. Aria looked down at her hands. "You almost died." Adrian frowned slightly. "I am still alive. But you almost died, because of me." Adrian watched her for a few seconds. Then he reached out, placing his hand gently over her wrist. "No," he said softly. "I chose to stay beside you and was ready to protect you." Aria lifted her head to look at him, a long silence stretching between them. Then she said something she had never dared to utter before. "I was afraid." Adrian was slightly surprised. "I thought that, if you died..." Her voice trailed off. "I wouldn't know what to do." Adrian gazed at her for a long time. "Aria." It was the first time he had called her name with such a tender voice. "I have fought for half my life," he said. "I do not fear death." He paused for a second. "But I fear one thing." Aria whispered. "What?" Adrian looked directly into her eyes. "I fear that one day you will leave, and I will never see you again." Aria's heart trembled. She said nothing. Instead, she leaned down and kissed him. The kiss was gentle at first, but as Adrian reached up to embrace her, it grew deeper. No more war, no more Silver Council, no more fear. Only the two of them, after everything that had transpired. When they pulled apart, Aria's forehead still rested lightly against his. "I will not leave," she whispered. "Never." Adrian smiled faintly. The next morning, Aria left Adrian's room and walked down to the courtyard behind the palace. Lysander was already standing by the palace's stone gate when Aria arrived. His shoulder was still bandaged in white, blood seeping through the fabric, yet he stood straight like a warrior accustomed to enduring pain. "Where are you going?" Aria asked. Lysander looked toward the distant forest. "I have worked for the Silver Council for nearly my entire life," he said slowly. "People in this palace have reasons not to trust me." Aria shook her head. "You saved me." Lysander smiled faintly. "I was raised to kill you." He turned to look at her. "But you taught me how to protect." A silence passed. Just then, Adrian approached and stood beside Aria. He placed his hand on her shoulder by instinct, his sharp alpha gaze fixed on Lysander. But this time, there was no hostility, only recognition. Adrian said, "You may leave if you wish." Lysander raised an eyebrow. "But if you stay," Adrian continued, "you will fight for the Luna Queen." Lysander looked at Aria, then he bowed his head slightly, not like a forced alpha, but like a warrior choosing the one he wished to protect. "This time," he said softly, "I will be on the right side." "You fought well," Adrian said. Lysander gave a slight shrug. "Perhaps for the first time in my life, I fought on the right side." 3 days later, the great hall of the palace was packed. Alphas from various packs had arrived. They stood in long rows beneath the massive stone pillars of the hall, as High Elder Cassian stepped into the center of the room. Aria stood at the heart of the hall, Adrian beside her. Cassian raised his staff. "Today," he said, his voice echoing through the chamber, "we witnessed the return of the Luna Queen." The Alphas bowed their heads. Cassian continued, When a Luna chooses her mate, he looked at Aria and Adrian. The entire wolf kind will feel it. Aria turned to Adrian, her heart pounding. Adrian looked at her, his gaze calm yet warm. Aria reached out her hand. Adrian grasped it, and at that very moment, a wave of energy rippled through the hall. The alphas in the room froze in unison. Then, one by one, they knelt. Not out of fear, not because they were forced, but because of the primal instinct of the wolf kind. Cassian smiled faintly. The mate bond has been chosen. Aria looked around the hall where the alphas were kneeling. Then she looked at Adrian, the man who had always stood beside her and protected her as he had promised. Aria said softly, "It feels as if the whole world is kneeling before us." Adrian replied calmly and gently, "No, they are kneeling before you, and I am merely the one lucky enough to stand beside you." And under the torchlight of the hall, the Luna Queen and the Alpha King stood together as the entire wolf world bowed before them.